Thank you. Well, it is really good to be here in a slightly different space for me, and it feels like we're having an important conversation. So yeah, I'm pleased to be a part of it. And I wanted to just begin by introducing myself a little in relation to issues of power, and particularly attentiveness to power, as Nigel did in his paper, and you might even call it a kind of conversion to attentiveness to power, perhaps. So to begin in that way, I'm white, as you can see. I'm female. I'm both a bit shocked as well as a bit energised by having recently turned 40. My family background might be described as lower middle class. We had salad cream instead of mayonnaise, margarine instead of butter.
Was the ketchup in the fridge or the cupboard?
Cupboard. I don't know what that means.
Ketchup's in the fridge.
Oh, really? Oh, yes. Well, and due to some difficult circumstances, we had very little money for a number of years. I love the way that Grayson Perry has talked about class. He describes a middle-class sentiment as striving.
Yeah.
And perhaps I think we were the strivers of the striving. I think aware and motivated towards education and achievement, while at times still needing the assistance of state benefits in order to make those dreams happen. And my working life has focused primarily really on incarnational urban ministry, particularly in marginalised urban communities, and subsequently now broader themes of community engagement, theological reflection and learning. I worked recruiting, training and supporting incarnational urban mission teams for 9 years, and this experience made me curious, frankly, about the assumptions that we bring to marginalised communities and the realities that we might find should we pay close enough attention to them. For much of that time, I also lived in a community in Manchester that was among the 5% most deprived in the country, according to government statistics. Getting to know people locally and belonging there and yet feeling different in ways that I perceived as both positive and negative sharpened my thinking. And in my work context, I was really aware that the organisational rhetoric of mission differed from the experiences of teams in communities. And there was actually no forum really for either team members, let alone urban community members, to speak back to that rhetoric, unless as a kind of coached and highly structured testimony. And as I began a programme of research to try and dig into the questions that I had, I felt it was important to hear the real experiences. So I focused my research on mission team members and urban community members who'd met those teams. And my research was about what's going on in these relationships. What is happening? Is it what we thought it might be? And are we making more of a mess of things? Or are we actually doing something useful? I think a key power question is who gets to define mission or give feedback on how it affects them. Denominations passing down models or recipients who are often invisible in the strategy development process. And who writes the rhetoric that we share then about the work of mission. So alongside those concerns that I was grappling with in my working day, my observation and attentiveness in my urban community also was kind of playing a role here. And I guess one of the conclusions that I've come to over time is that one of the gifts of the urban and perhaps particularly marginalisation might offer to wider church and society is a sense, an experience, a revelation of God's love for us in all our mess and vulnerability, in our powerlessness, if you like. I think owning and accepting my own brokenness is part of my attentiveness to power, and coming from that kind of aspiring, striving kind of background perhaps has a can prevent you sometimes from wanting to own your own brokenness, from wanting to admit, to not having it all together at times. So owning and accepting my own brokenness is part of attentiveness to power, as is owning my own privilege. I am both victim and oppressor. We all are. And by this, I guess I'm wanting to say that power and powerlessness are not neatly carved up or easily separated. They're messy, they're within us all, and our relationship to them is actually messy. But at the core, I think, is an issue of personhood. And it's to this that I'll return in the context of talking about some shifts in thinking in what we might call helping professions, and my own research into how change happens in urban mission. So there is an evolving story, I think, in the statutory sector and in some third sector agencies at the moment. A desire, and I call it a desire, it's in different stages in different places, I think, to shift from deficit or needs-based models of engaging with communities to strengths-based approaches. And I stick this typology up here, and I'll talk through it very, very briefly. But just as a way of framing some of the issues and some of the diversity within what we're talking about. Those of you who've had any involvement with community development as a tradition will recognise that it's inherently strengths-based. It is about, the language of empowerment is often used, is about drawing people's giftings out. But those values haven't been prioritised in the statutory and charity sectors by and large. They've become dominated by a needs-based ethos, which takes primarily a service delivery approach. And this quadrant shows two broad approaches, strengths-based and needs-based, and four broad models. So the vertical axis gets to the heart of the issue, I think. This, for me, is the fundamental core conviction which will shape how you engage with your community engagement. Your perception of the community. Through a lack of connection or just making assumptions, lots of us slip into impoverished, simplistic ideas about our communities. We only see them in terms of their lack or their needs, materially and often spiritually. But inevitably, every person, including you and me, has both gifts and needs. The other axis, the horizontal, is about the type of activity which is best suited to address a situation. It's more pragmatic. So if you're clear on what you think, or often people are unconsciously coming to conclusions, but if you have an assumption one way or another, or a conclusion on your perception of the community, then choosing a model becomes much easier. And I'll just talk through the different areas very, very briefly. So starting with provision, down in the bottom left-hand corner. This is a dominant model within the vast majority of our charity and statutory sectors. We give what you need. People who engage with provision are service users. And it is a kind of simply to address, usually a very defined need. So the model is very, very practical. We are here to offer X meals a day to X number of people. We try to do as many as possible, and that's how we know we're efficient, we're working well. So provision. But it's based on a purely needs-focused perception of your community, and it chooses a service or a programme in order to deliver what it thinks is needed.
Is it true also we often define the needs?
Yes, absolutely.
So we decided what people in a food bank are going to eat, and we go and collect it for them.
Completely. So within that model there is a separation between us and them. There's the external agency who come in, often they might do some consultation, they may not. They may look at a bunch of research reports written about that community, written 5 years ago, and decide from that basis what is actually necessary. So yes, needless to say, I think there's a place for it, but a much, much, much smaller place than it currently has within our world. So then moving across to advocacy, which arguably has a much friendlier face. It's more relationship focused. So it's about coming alongside, perhaps working relationally to do things on behalf of, to do things for. But fundamentally, it still actually takes a negative perception of the person that it's trying to help. So you still end up with this expert-client relationship when you're filling in a form for someone, or making a phone call for someone on someone's behalf, or considering that one group of people or person is in a situation of injustice and you're the person to raise your voice, to give them a voice on that issue. Your perception of that person is still based on their need, their lack. So moving up then to what happens if you perhaps take a more positive perception of the community. What happens if you see people not just in terms of their lack, but actually in terms of their strength, their gift, that they might actually have something to offer in addressing the situation that they are facing. And so you end up perhaps with co-production. So co-production is when you have that positive attitude towards your community. You're looking for what they've got to offer to the situation, but you also perhaps think that a programme or a service is the best model. And so co-production is about working together. It goes beyond consultation, despite what some statutory sector co-production branded things might look like. I argue there is often a real difference between using the language of co-production particularly and actually the reality of shared power. So it is about different partners bringing different expertise. So those of you familiar with these areas will know the phrase expert by experience. So someone might bring their expertise from their experience, someone else might bring their expertise from their training. Both are equally valued in a co-productive environment. Both are essential in order to shape a service or programme to meet a need. And then the fourth aspect of this quadrant is community development. And I've put ABCD there. Many of you will be familiar with asset-based community development, which really is a recent reiteration of the historic values of the community development tradition. It's given it a whole new thrust of energy. It's given lots of people the opportunity to kind of think, okay, this is a thing we can get hold of in a way that we perhaps haven't been able to in the past. So there's a lot to be said for it, but it is part of a longer tradition. And within community development, the perception is, well, maybe we want to work relationally. Maybe this issue is not best addressed with a programme or a service. Maybe what we need is a vibrant community life rather than another programme or service. And so the relationships become that of neighbours, collaborators together in creating something. So I would suggest there can be a place for each type of activity. And in practice, the lines often aren't clear-cut. But you can really identify the underlying assumptions, and particularly that positive or negative understanding of the person within these models, and then the practices that they then lead to. Each of them has limitations. They'll create different kinds of outcomes, and it might well be appropriate to use provision, a needs-based service delivery approach, in a limited number of circumstances, like ensuring universal access to basic things such as housing, for example, prescriptions. There are probably ways to that where that is actually the most appropriate way. I'm not saying that that's entirely inappropriate, but I do think it is the weakest model, actually, fundamentally because of its limited perception of people. It generally doesn't build community, and it generally doesn't support people in making life change. It simply ticks that one box of that one thing that they happen to be missing on that day. That's not to say that box isn't valid, but it's limited. So it should actually, I think, be the smallest part of our picture. But in most cases, it's the dominant model. And there are reasons for this, and Nigel touched on some of them. But changing from a negative, needs-based perception of people to a more positive, strengths-based view requires deep culture change. And often it's charities, actually, that find it most difficult to respond. Perhaps because the whole culture and ethos of provision or charity becomes self-perpetuating. They need the needy as their case for support.
Oh, yes.
And that's a fundamental challenge when you're trying to survive as a charity in a very difficult climate. and also trying to look at how you enable broader life change for people. I guess the challenge for us is that the church is caught up in this. There's been a drive for the church to position itself as a third sector agency in order to find a voice in the public sphere, in order to find a way to speak in public, so we can speak out about food poverty because of our involvement in food banks. So we are at risk in finding ourselves another charitable agency delivering charitable services along with everyone else. In addition to that, for many within churches, our theology is itself a stumbling block. We, the church, understand ourselves as the ones with the answers to the world's need. And what is the answer? Jesus, we all know it. Our articulations of theologies of salvation are usually inherently needs-based. And that's interesting. The reality is that we are all people with both gifts and needs. The needs-based approach is unbalanced. And perhaps I would suggest a needs-based theology is also unbalanced. Let's hold that thought for a moment and think a bit about change. What actually enables change? And to get at that, we need to have some understanding of how change happens. And that was the question I brought to my doctoral research. So what does it take to change a life, was my question. I was in a setting where I could see loads of missional teams around me working really, really hard to try to see lives changed using the rhetoric of transformation. And my sense was that stuff was happening, but it didn't fit with our expectations. And the rhetoric of transformation was kind of covering that up, but covering up a whole load of tensions that were bubbling along underneath. And I wanted to get to the reality. What might it take to change a life? And did incarnational urban mission, as we were doing it then, help or hinder in that task? So drawing on models of pastoral care, qualitative and ethnographic research in communities, and work from psychology, work from organisational management, and different fields, I was kind of drawing together theories and looking at what I was seeing in the interviews that I did and the life experiences that I was hearing about. And I think for me, what came out of that research was that life change involves a change in meaning system. So by meaning system, I mean our worldview, the set of beliefs, assumptions, understandings that we each have about the way the world works and what is true. Our meaning system then shapes how we interpret our experiences. Just a quick example. I wanted to make macarons, you know, those beautiful little brightly coloured, nice crunchy things. I thought I'd have a go at making macarons. And I've done some baking in the past, so I got my recipe, you know, got my ingredients together, had to go. Basically, I made the worst macarons you've ever seen. They were grey, they were splodges rather than round, they were soft rather than crispy. They were just all shades of wrong. My husband, bless him, was very kind and said, well, they taste great. Just scraped them off the greaseproof paper and ate them anyway. But they were horrible. The way that I thought about that experience could have gone two ways, couldn't it? I could have decided, okay, I've made the worst macarons I've ever seen. I should never bake again. This is clearly a disaster. I'm not cut out for baking in any way. Macaron making is just not my thing. I just should never do this. But I didn't conclude that. I blamed the food colouring. And the reason that I blame the food colouring is because I've had a bit of a track record as a half-decent baker. You know, I can follow a recipe. And, you know, I had a meaning system that included my competence as a baker. So I brought that meaning system to this experience of disastrous macarons, and I interpreted it as being not a problem with my skills as a baker, but a problem with my ingredients. And as it turned out, it was, you need the creamy stuff, not the liquid. I put too much liquid in. Anyway, so So another example of our worldviews and how we then use them to interpret and understand the experiences that we have in life. So if you believe that non-Christians are lost sinners and Christians are found saints, you might then assume that the neighbour you've just started to get to know really needs your help, your support and your advice. You might offer that to them, and when they don't seem interested or even grateful, you might assume that in their lostness they're just blind to the good news. However, if your meaning system speaks of the image of God in every person, whether they know him or not, if it speaks of original goodness and the work of the Spirit in the world, you might approach that person seeking to learn something of God from them rather than to offer your advice. So that's how meaning systems work and profoundly shape the way that we engage with our world. And my research showed that there were two necessary elements to bring about a change in our meaning systems. The first is a challenge to perspective. It doesn't sound particularly radical, does it? But that refers to the way that we can be open to new thoughts through daily interactions over time, in words, in practices, that challenge our existing meaning system. Our current ways of seeing the world can be called into question. So that might be, God can't love me, I won't amount to anything, I could never be a doctor, lawyer, whatever. Or God can't speak through them, I've got to be busy all the time, church should be X, Y, Z. Think of Jesus' parables. He took ordinary, familiar situations and he subverted them, made them strange and challenging, to open people to new ways of seeing the world. That's what I'm talking about when I'm mentioning a challenge to perspective. But such that that challenge doesn't become overwhelming, the other essential factor to then enabling a change in meaning system is an affirmation of personhood. By personhood, I mean the worth, the wonder, the reality of your existence. It's a more fundamental category than identity or selfhood, which perhaps refer to the nature or content of a person and might be important to engage with, but personhood is about the fact of a person's existence and humanity. Personhood and the exercise of it, which you might describe as agency, are about the value or worth and significance or responsibility of a person. The fact that we all make a dent in the world. Affirming people simply as persons offers a safe enough space for them to experiment with new understandings of themselves, their relationships, others, how the world works. But you need both to come together. Having your perspectives, your meaning system challenged in some way, alongside that affirmation of your worth and significance as a person, when they come together, there is a playful, safe space created where you can dare to try out a different way of seeing your world. So in the light of all this, what might be the power relationship between church and community? And as I alluded to above, the most common posture of the church towards the community is to seek to change the community. That's generally what we think our job is. But what I saw in my research is that missional encounters changed the Christians as much as they changed those they were setting out to change. And this was a surprise to the Christians, to be honest. They weren't expecting it. And often didn't quite know how to handle it. Weren't even sure if that was something gone wrong. Weren't even sure perhaps whether they were losing something vital of their faith by allowing themselves to receive or to be challenged or changed in their theology by the people that they came across. We so often perceive ourselves to be givers in our communities. Often our church culture, our theology, reinforces our own power and agency while completely ignoring the power and agency of people in our neighbourhoods. But I would suggest, as Nigel has already done, that God is at work in the world, and that as we encounter him, we are all changed. That God's mission is as much to the church as it is to our communities. And I think this happens as we receive God in unexpected guises. God comes to us disguised as our life. Wise and terrifying words. I both love it and resent it, I think in pretty much equal quantities. We often use the language of the other, don't we? When we think about community engagement, how do we reach out to the other out there? But we really need self-awareness in our use of the word other. In itself, it is a label, isn't it? By referring to someone as other, you have already decided that they are different to you, perhaps without even knowing whether or not that might be true. In that very exchange, you define them in relation to yourself rather than letting them emerge as a person, rather than acknowledging their personhood. Perhaps we can be changed when we recognise that God comes to us as the other at the margins. God is the one we have decided is different, that we have othered. And when we begin to see them, not in fact as other, but as a person, made in God's image, with something of him as a gift to share with us. If we want to see change in communities, or if we think there is a need for change in the church, then we need to create the conditions for meaning systems to be disrupted and rebuilt. Challenge to perspective and affirmation of personhood. And perhaps it's God's gift that church and community can be that opportunity for one another, that God comes as the person at the margins. And his coming can enable us to see ourselves and our communities differently, and together to be changed. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you.